You leave your office at 7 p.m. and you're one of the first ones out the door. Your manager is still at his desk. So is nearly everyone else on your floor. Nobody told you to stay later. Nobody had to. If you lived and worked in South Korea, this wouldn't feel unusual. It would just feel like Tuesday. South Korea has some of the longest average working hours among the world's wealthy nations, year after year, even as its economy has grown into one of the most technologically advanced on the planet. So why does a country with such staggering wealth, brilliant infrastructure, and some of the best educated young people in the world still work this hard? The answer isn't laziness on anyone else's part, and it isn't simply cultural preference either. It's something closer to a habit the entire country built together out of necessity that never fully wore off once the necessity passed. To understand it, you have to go back to the 1960s when this habit wasn't optional. Under President Park Chung-hee, South Korea's entire economic strategy depended on outworking wealthier, more established competitors. The country had almost no natural resources, no established industrial base, and no reputation for quality manufacturing. What it had was labor, and a government willing to mobilize that labor with extraordinary intensity. Factory shifts routinely stretched past 12 hours. 6-day work weeks were standard, not exceptional. Sociologist Hagen Koo, who has studied Korean labor extensively, has described this period as a form of compressed industrialization, where decades of typical development were squeezed into a fraction of the usual time, and workers absorbed that compression directly into their daily schedules. Picture what that actually looked like for an ordinary factory worker in the 1970s. You might wake before sunrise, walk to a textile plant, and stand at a machine for 12 or more hours with only short breaks. Your wages would be modest, deliberately kept low to keep Korean exports competitively priced against wealthier nations. You would go home exhausted, sleep, and repeat the same schedule the next day, 6 days a week, for years. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the growth strategy. It was, in a very real sense, the strategy itself. Here's the part that's easy to forget when you only look at the impressive GDP charts. This intensity wasn't spread evenly or chosen freely by the people living through it. Independent labor unions were heavily restricted for much of this period, meaning workers had limited ability to negotiate for shorter hours, even as the economy around them grew wealthier. Historian Nam-hee Lee has documented how labor activism that did emerge, including hunger strikes and self-immolations by workers demanding basic rights, was frequently met with suppression rather than negotiation. The long hours that built the country's wealth were not simply hard work freely chosen. They were, for much of this history, hard work enforced. So how did a system built on enforced overtime survive democratization in the late 1980s, when workers finally gained the political power to demand change? Partly, it didn't, not entirely. Average working hours have actually fallen significantly since their peak, and the government has passed real reforms, including a mandated 52-hour maximum work week introduced in recent years specifically to curb some of the most extreme overtime culture. But even after those reforms, South Korea's average hours remain notably higher than most other wealthy nations, including Japan, Germany, and the United States. The legal ceiling came down. The cultural habit didn't fall nearly as fast. This is the counterintuitive twist worth sitting with. Once an entire society organizes its self-image around outworking everyone else for a generation, that identity doesn't simply switch off once the emergency that created it has technically ended. Long hours became tangled up with something deeper than productivity. They became a marker of loyalty, seriousness, and social status. Leaving the office before your manager, even when your actual work is finished, can still be read as a quiet signal that you aren't fully committed, an unspoken judgment that persists in many workplaces regardless of what the law technically permits. There's also a structural piece that keeps the habit alive. South Korea's education system is famously intense, with many students spending evenings at private after-school academies called hagwons well into the night, chasing entrance into a small number of elite universities that still heavily determine career trajectories. Economist Yongchan Kim has pointed out that this early conditioning toward extreme competitive effort doesn't simply disappear once someone enters the workforce. It carries directly into adult working life, reinforced by a labor market where job security and career advancement remain closely tied to visible effort and tenure. Corporate culture reinforces the same pattern from a different angle. Many Korean workplaces, particularly inside the large Chaebol conglomerates that dominate the economy, still operate with rigid seniority structures, where junior employees are expected to defer visibly to those above them. Staying late isn't always about finishing tasks. It's frequently about signaling deference within a hierarchy, where showing up before your boss and leaving after your boss carries real, if unspoken, weight. Company dinners, called hosik, often extend the workday even further into the evening, blending mandatory socializing with professional obligation in a way that blurs any clean line between work hours and personal time. Picture the full arc, side by side. A textile worker in 1970 standing at a machine for 12 hours because the survival of the entire national economy depended on people just like her doing exactly that. A student in 2010 sitting in a hagwon classroom until midnight, competing for one of a limited number of university spots that will shape the rest of their life. An office worker today staying past quitting time not because the workload demands it, but because leaving early still carries a quiet social cost nobody officially wrote down anywhere. 3 different decades, 3 different settings, one continuous thread running through all of them. This is starting to change, and it's worth being honest about that too. Younger Korean workers, sometimes labeled the MZ generation in local media, have begun pushing back more openly against long hours culture, prioritizing work-life balance in ways that would have been far riskier to express even 15 years ago. Some companies have begun experimenting with stricter overtime limits and more flexible schedules in response to genuine labor shortages and declining birth rates that have made keeping younger talent a real competitive concern. Here's what this reflects back onto you. It's tempting to look at extreme work culture and assume it must simply reflect what a society values, as if long hours were just an expression of national character. The more honest version of this story is less comfortable. What actually built this habit was a specific historical emergency, deliberately engineered by a government that needed maximum labor output to survive economically, sustained by restrictions that limited how much workers could push back, and eventually absorbed so deeply into daily life that it outlived the crisis that created it by decades. You started this wondering why staying at your desk until 7 p.m. would feel completely ordinary in one particular country. Now, it isn't really about a culture that simply loves work. It's about a habit built during genuine survival, one that proved far easier to start than to fully put down, even long after the emergency that demanded it had technically passed.